And good morning, 12IB. What I'm going to be doing for you guys today is I'm going to try to go over the main causes, practices, and effects of World War One as a conflict. I'm going to try to summarize the main points here, and I'm going to try to get a sense of what you guys need to focus on as students studying for your IB exams. And obviously, I'm going to have it here on YouTube, give you guys a chance to sort of take a break from reading and just listen to me. In terms of causes, this is pretty basic. You guys can use the acronym MAIN to keep track of them. And MAIN is militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So it's pretty straightforward on the whole. In terms of militarism, essentially the case is that European powers became more militaristic. They became focused on developing their armies and making their armies much bigger and much more aggressive. So the biggest example, of course, of this is conscription. The thing about World War One is it's a war on a much bigger scale than previous wars. In previous wars, armies were actually much smaller because they were typically private armies or, not private armies, but they weren't recruited from everybody in the population. They had people that were professionals that were brought in, and now everybody pretty much had embraced conscription. In fact, the only country that didn't have conscription was Great Britain. The main reason for that is that Great Britain never really had an army in the traditional sense. They just kind of recruited an army whenever they needed it. Their army was referred to as the British Expeditionary Force. Militarism meant that the nations of Europe were much more focused on becoming military powers. And this meant that they were racing to have bigger armies, bigger armaments, and this created an arms race. One of the ways in which this manifested was the naval arms race. Now, the Germans, driven primarily by Admiral Tirpitz, wanted a navy to match Britain's. And Britain, of course, had just developed its new technology, the dreadnought, which literally means fear none. And the dreadnought was a much more powerful battleship than anything that had been seen at that point. They ended up pushing it into production. Germany also pushes their navy into production. Now, this militarism did contribute very heavily to the European powers and how much tension they had, because of course they saw that they were much more in need of development, and this creates an arms race situation where each European nation was racing to have a bigger army and to become more powerful. And yes, this creates a lot of tension. So militarism is definitely a major cause of World War One and one that definitely resulted in more tensions. So besides that, the alliances, perhaps one of the most significant causes of World War One, because that's really the way in which World War One became a global conflict. The distrust of the allied nations for one another really led to them forming these alliances out of a need to protect themselves, but in many ways it just ended up making the other nations more paranoid. Now, it's important to note that the alliances for the most part were secret agreements. These weren't open agreements. This is actually one of the reasons that Woodrow Wilson's 14 points open with the desire for open covenants openly arrived at. He mentions the term open or some variation thereof twice, to sort of indicate that secret treaties were a big cause of the war. So yes, they did drive the tension forward. In terms of alliances, you do need to keep track of some dates. The four key dates are 1879, which is when the Dual Alliance happened, 1882, that's the Triple Alliance, and of course, 1904, the Dual Entente, 1907, the Triple Entente. This creates two major camps, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. Central Powers obviously in the center, the alliance outside. So were the alliances a big cause? Obviously, because of the alliances, the Balkan crisis would balloon and become an actual global problem, and it would end up dragging in all these nations. On top of that, the alliances created a state of heightened tension, where the Germans, the Austrians, and the Italians were sort of in the center here, and the other nations of Europe were suspicious of what they were up to. And as we know, Italy would end up changing sides in the middle of the war, so this shows that a lot of the times the allegiances weren't quite clear. It wasn't really sure who wanted who on whose side. It's also important to note that, for example, in the case of Britain and France, their alliance was actually a pretty recent phenomenon. In the Napoleonic era, they were actually at odds with one another, and so this alliance represented a departure from that traditional way of doing business. So, imperialism, obviously also very important, because imperialism was driven by this need to gain more resources. A lot of the nations of Europe now at this stage had embraced a model known as neo-mercantilism. And the philosophy behind neo-mercantilism is that you maximize exports, minimize imports. The best way to do this is if you have a lot of raw material coming in. And the raw material came from, obviously, the colonies. So in the 19th century, this is really when the scramble for Africa takes place. A little bit of integration with your English books. Heart of Darkness really depicts this time in history where the scramble for Africa had heightened. The part where he looks at the colored map, this sort of shows who got what. And imperialism was a really big driving factor in World War I's outbreak because the European powers were likely to see each other as a threat to imperial dominance. And they were likely to see each other as a threat to resource gathering. Not just that, the Kaiser Wilhelm didn't make things better for himself. For example, he knew that France was trying to maintain its control over Morocco, and so on several occasions he tried to intervene, and he tried to guarantee that the Moroccans would be freed from French aggression. And France obviously had a big problem with that, because the idea was they saw themselves as the ones who were fundamentally responsible for that region. So what happened was, of course, the Kaiser sent out a gunboat known as the SMS Panther, and he sent it to the port of Agadir in 1911. This was considered a really big gesture because he was actually creating tension here and showing that he was willing to go to war over this. Germany, of course, very famously stated it wanted its place in the sun, and this quote really indicates to us how badly Germany wanted to try and create its own empire, which was something that France and Britain just didn't think was possible, that they didn't think they could tolerate at all. So the N in Maine is, of course, nationalism. And yes, this is a very recent phenomenon. Before, European nations, many of them didn't really exist in the literal sense. Italy didn't exist, Germany didn't exist. So a lot of nations had been formed, and these nations were very much focused on the idea of their strength as a country and their right to expand. So this became a very big deal for the Germans. This became a very big deal for the French and the British. It created a new push towards wanting to fight for your nation, wanting to sacrifice for your nation. And so a lot of the nationalism we see here would definitely be a contributing factor in the outbreak of World War I. The more important sense in which nationalism can be considered a cause for World War I is the Balkan nationalism. And as you guys know, there were several major crises in the Balkans. The first was the Bosnian crisis, and this is in 1908. This is when Bosnia-Herzegovina was annexed by Austria-Hungary. And then, of course, you had the Balkan Wars between 1911 and 1912. And this was the point at which the Balkan nations managed to push out the rest of the Ottomans. So the Balkan nations did want to be united in one case with one another, and also they wanted to be their own nations. They didn't want empires. But on the other side of the coin, you had the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and they did want to try and create more of an imperial hold over Europe. Austria-Hungary itself wasn't called Austria-Hungary until after Germany was formed, and Germany sort of created this new balance of power whereby Austria wasn't as relevant. So they actually had to compromise. This was literally what it was called, the compromise, and they had Hungary kind of separate from them, but not quite. So really, it was all about the tension between the different powers of Europe, and the situation was just heightened by the fact that Germany just came off as aggressive a lot of the time. And this is really the big debate. Was it that Germany was simply one of the other nations that was reacting to the push and the pull of international events, or was it that Germany was the belligerent state that was seeking to actually spark a war through this international crisis? So really, the main debate centers on what was it that Germany was trying to accomplish by entering the war. The way people see it is that when they gave Austria the blank check, they weren't seriously telling Austria, this is after, of course, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated during the July crisis. They argued, well, these historians argue that the blank check was more of a show of good faith. And one of the great arguments in favor of this way of seeing it is that the Kaiser gave the blank check and then he went on his vacation during this very tense period. So this doesn't really show that he was that devoted to the idea of going to war over it. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that the Kaiser Wilhelm was a very warlike and aggressive leader. But at the same time, you also have evidence that the Social Democrats in Germany actually pushed Kaiser Wilhelm away from this way of looking at things. Anyway, 1914, war breaks out. So, broadly speaking, we see the Western Front when we talk about World War I and the Eastern Front. Eastern Front isn't discussed as much, not as significant to the conflict, really, and also not really as central, because the major powers were fighting on the Western Front. So the Western Front, as we know, is typically equated with trench warfare, and that's really how it is. A lot of these battles were very aggressive, very protracted, and they didn't really result in many territorial gains for the Allied powers or the Central powers, because there just wasn't really any strategy for the most part. You have major battles like the Somme and Verdun, which were based on just these massive offensives, and also in Verdun you had this focus on trying to use tactics of attrition to try and weaken the enemy. So very heavily reliance on artillery, very heavily reliance on distance-based warfare, not a lot of new strategies. And this is something that really changed towards the end of the war when a lot of more skilled generals took over. But initially, the strategy really did boil down to just try and hit with as much strength as possible. So in terms of effects, it's pretty simple, really. Europe changed a lot geographically. So you had a departure from this traditional Europe, which was very much imperial, and you had a new Europe that was more nation-based. So the Paris Peace Conference was really the point at which the European powers reshaped Europe. So on the whole, you have 9 new nations that are formed in the aftermath of the Paris Peace Conference, and these are Finland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. So there were 5 major treaties after, as part of the Paris Peace Conference, and each one focused on a different aspect. So one of the things that Woodrow Wilson, the American president, brought to the table was this need for self-determination. So this is one of the ways in which he really did influence the negotiations. Now, in terms of getting the Allied powers to sort of go easy on Germany, there was no dice there. They just weren't hearing it. They were too angry based on how Germany had, in their mind, started the conflict. So what they were really trying to focus on was punishing Germany as much as possible. This, we've gone over it countless times, so there's really nothing here to focus on in terms of giving more detail. What is important to focus on is, of course, the fact that Germany was asked to take blame for the war, something they resented, obviously, that the Allied powers imposed a lot of terms on the European powers, and they focused on taking away territories from the major empires and forming new nations. So this is sort of the major effect of it. Obviously, unprecedented loss of life. This was a very big deal for it. Socially, World War I pushed Europe in the direction of modernization. For the most part, people saw that these governments, these very militaristic, imperialistic, and aggressive governments, had pushed them into this terrible situation. So there were reform movements in France and Britain to try and create new governments. Indeed, the same happened in Germany. And the Weimar Republic, despite the fact that it was perceived by many as being this failed government, was an attempt to create a more liberal, modern German state. This is what people wanted. They wanted to try and move away from it. Now, in many ways, things didn't change because, for example, Britain and France were dismantling empires, but at the same time, they actually expanded into the Middle East and they kind of just took over Ottoman Empire territories and absorbed them into their own spheres of influence. Now, they didn't call them empires per se, but they were, in fact, empires. So it's very important to see this. Once again, the conflict as a whole really shaped Europe geographically and politically, and it did lead to the first attempt at international cooperation, otherwise known as the League of Nations. World War I as a conflict really did represent a turning point. It sort of showed total war in a whole new light, and it represented this major conflict that people believed really set the standard for modern warfare. And war had become much bigger and much more destructive as a result of World War I. Now, in terms of things you want to focus on for the IB, obviously the extent to which certain causes could be responsible, the argument of whether or not Germany was to blame, and of course, what the major effects were and how Europe was reshaped. In any case, there are lots of online resources I'm going to try to link you to, and hopefully those will give you guys a better idea of what it is you need to focus on. In any case, that's my summary, and well, good luck with it, obviously.